The winter of 1876 gripped the Wind River Valley like a wolf's jaw, its teeth of ice and snow biting deep into the sacred hunting grounds where the Shoshone had wintered for countless generations. Here, beneath the towering peaks that scraped the belly of the sky, Chief Red Hawk's band had erected their lodge circle in the ancient way, buffalo hide tipis arranged in precise harmony with the four directions, smoke rising from central fires. Like prayers ascending to the Great Spirit, Morning Star, daughter of Chief Red Hawk, knelt beside the frozen creek that cut through their winter sanctuary, her breath forming clouds as she cracked through the ice to reach the flowing water beneath.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
At 19 winters, she possessed the kind of beauty that made warriors compose songs and medicine men speak of visions sent from the spirit world. Her black hair fell like a waterfall of night to her waist, adorned with eagle feathers earned through acts of courage that would have made seasoned braves proud. Her eyes, dark as the depths of sacred springs, held intelligence that unnerved the elders and fire that made young men forget their own names. But it was not her beauty that set Morning Star apart from other women of the tribe. It was her defiance of the invisible chains that bound women to the lodge circle, her hunger for the wild places where only hunters were meant to walk, and her refusal to accept that her destiny lay in grinding corn and weaving baskets while her spirit yearned to ride the wind across endless prairies. The sound of approaching horses made Morning Star rise from her work, water jug balanced on her hip as she watched her father's hunting party return from their week-long pursuit of the great elk herd that had been spotted near the sacred hot springs. Chief Red Hawk rode at the head of the column, his massive frame draped in wolf pelts, his weathered face bearing the expression of a man who had tasted failure and found it bitter as winter berries. Out behind him rode 12 warriors, their mounts steaming in the cold air, their travois empty except for a few small deer that would barely feed the camp for 2 days. These were not the mighty hunters who had once brought down buffalo herds that darkened the prairie like storm clouds. These were desperate men returning to a starving camp with empty hands and haunted eyes. "The elk have vanished," announced Broken Lance, the war chief whose scars told the story of 100 battles with enemy tribes and white soldiers alike. His voice carried across the camp like a death song. "We followed their trail for 4 days until it simply ended, as if the spirits lifted them from the earth itself." Chief Red Hawk dismounted with the heavy movements of a man carrying more than his own weight. The responsibility for 300 souls pressed down on his broad shoulders like a mountain, and Morning Star could see the way it aged him with each passing day. "The white hunters have been here," he said, his voice cutting through the cold air like a blade. "Their wagon tracks circle the hot springs like vultures around carrion. They have driven away the elk, killed the young, scattered the herds that were meant to sustain us through the hungry time." A murmur of anger rippled through the gathered people, but it was the hollow sound of wolves howling at an empty sky. Anger could not fill empty bellies or warm children whose ribs showed through their winter clothing like the bars of a cage. Morning Star stepped forward, her heart pounding with the same rhythm that had driven her since childhood to seek answers where others found only questions. "Father, let me take a hunting party to the northern valleys. The white hunters have not penetrated that far, and there may still be game in the hidden places where our grandfathers once hunted." The silence that followed her words was deeper than the snow that blanketed the mountains. Chief Red Hawk turned to face his daughter, and in his eyes she saw the eternal struggle between love and tradition, between the desperate needs of survival and the ancient laws that governed their people. "A woman does not hunt," said Iron Crow, the eldest of the war chiefs, his voice creaking like old leather. "It is forbidden by the laws handed down from the time of the first fires. You would bring bad medicine upon us all." Morning Star felt the familiar fire rise in her chest, the same flame that had driven her to master the bow in secret. to learn the tracks of every animal that walked their lands, to study the movement of herds with the dedication of a vision seeker. The laws were made in times of plenty, she replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of her transgression. But children do not eat laws, and tradition does not warm the lodge when the fire dies. Chief Red Hawk raised his hand for silence, but Morning Star could see the conflict warring in his weathered features. He was a father who had watched his daughter surpass many of his warriors in skill and courage, and a chief who had seen too. Many of his people die from hunger and cold. The weight of leadership had taught him that sometimes survival demanded choices that would have been unthinkable in better times. The northern valleys are dangerous, he said finally. Beyond our usual hunting grounds, in territory where the Arikara war parties sometimes venture. If you were to encounter enemies, then I would deal with them as any hunter would, Morning Star replied, her hand moving instinctively to the knife at her belt, its handle worn smooth by countless hours of practice. I am not asking to go alone. Give me 3 warriors, and we will return with meat for the camp or not at all. The debate that followed raged like a prairie fire through the assembled people. Some of the younger warriors spoke in favor of Morning Star's proposal, having witnessed her skills in secret competitions, where she had outshot men twice her age. Others, led by Iron Crow and the traditional elders, declared that allowing a woman to hunt would anger the spirits and bring even greater misfortune upon their people. But it was the voice of Singing Wolf, the camp's medicine man, that finally swayed the decision. The old shaman emerged from his lodge like a figure from a vision, his ancient body wrapped in bare robes, his face painted with sacred symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the firelight. I have dreamed, he announced, his voice carrying the authority of one who spoke with the spirit world. In my vision, I saw a woman walking the path of the hunter, and in her footsteps, plenty returned to our people. But I also saw danger, darkness, and a choice that would echo through generations. Yet unborn. Chief Red Hawk studied his daughter's face, seeing there the same determination that had driven him to become a war chief in his youth, the same fire that had made their people strong when the world was younger and the buffalo still thundered. Across endless grasslands, finally he nodded slowly. You will take 3 volunteers, he decided. But you will hunt only for 2 days, and if you encounter any sign of enemy war parties, you will return immediately. The risk is great, but our need is greater. Morning Star felt triumph surge through her veins like warm blood, but she kept her expression composed as she bowed respectfully to her father. I will not fail you. As the camp settled into the routines of evening, Morning Star prepared for her unprecedented journey. She selected her finest bow, carved from mountain ash and strung with sinew from a great bull elk she had helped bring down in secret years before. Her arrows were works of art, each point napped from obsidian and feathered with hawk plumes. That caught the light like captured fire. 3 warriors volunteered to accompany her. Young Hawk, barely 18 and eager to prove himself. Gray Wolf, a seasoned hunter whose quiet confidence spoke of years in the wilderness. And Swift Runner, whose knowledge of the northern valleys exceeded that of any man in the tribe. They were good men, skilled and trustworthy, but Morning Star could see the uncertainty in their eyes. They had never followed a woman into the hunt, and the weight of tradition pressed against their minds like a physical force. That night, as the camp settled into sleep, Morning Star lay awake in her father's lodge, listening to the wind howl across the valley like the voices of ancient spirits. Tomorrow would bring her first true test as a hunter, the chance to prove that her dreams of running with the elk and tracking the great bears were more than the foolish fantasies of a woman who refused to accept her place. But beneath the excitement, a deeper current of unease moved through her thoughts. Singing Wolf's vision had spoken of danger and darkness, of choices that would echo through generations.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. back to the story.
As she drifted toward sleep, Morning Star wondered if some destinies were too large for any one person to carry, and if the path she had chosen might lead not to glory, but to a reckoning that would change everything she had ever known. The pre-dawn darkness was absolute when Morning Star woke, her body responding to rhythms older than memory. She dressed in silence, pulling on her warmest leggings and the wolfskin coat that had been her mother's, its fur still carrying the faint scent of the woman who had died bringing Morning Star into the world. As she gathered her hunting gear, she felt the weight of generations pressing down upon her shoulders, all the women who had remained in the lodge circle, who had accepted their roles without question, who had never known the wild freedom that called to her soul like a wolf, howling at the moon. The 4 hunters departed the camp while the stars still burned bright in the winter sky, their horses picking careful paths through snow that crunched like broken bones beneath their hooves. They rode in single file, Swift Runner leading them, along game trails that had been worn into the earth by countless generations of animals, seeking the same thing that drove them. Now survival in a harsh world that gave nothing freely and took everything without mercy. As they climbed higher into the mountains, leaving the relative warmth of the valley behind, Morning Star felt the familiar expansion of spirit that came with leaving the constraints of camp life. Here, in the wilderness where only the strong survived and the weak became food for scavengers, she felt truly alive for the first time in moons. The crisp air filled her lungs like a drug, and the vast panorama of snow-covered peaks stretching to the horizon spoke to something deep in her soul that no lodge fire could ever satisfy. They rode through the morning without speaking, each lost in their own thoughts as they navigated terrain that grew increasingly treacherous with altitude. The snow here was deeper, unmarked by human passage, holding the pristine silence of places where civilization had never set foot. But Morning Star's trained eyes read the subtle signs that others might miss, the disturbance in snow where deer had passed, the claw marks on tree bark that spoke of bear dens hidden in rocky crevices, the delicate tracks of winter birds that might lead them to water sources where larger game might gather. It was past midday when Swift Runner raised his hand for halt, his weathered face creased with concern as he studied the landscape ahead. They had reached a natural basin surrounded by towering cliffs, its floor covered with a grove of ancient cottonwoods, whose bare branches reached toward the sky like the fingers of buried giants. "There," Grey Wolf whispered, pointing toward the far edge of the grove. Morning Star followed his gaze and felt her heart leap with excitement. Moving through the trees like shadows given form were a small herd of perhaps 20 animals, their breath creating clouds of vapor as they dug through the snow to reach the grass beneath. They were magnificent creatures, their antlers casting intricate shadows on the pristine snow, their bodies radiating the health and vitality that had been absent from their own camp for too long. But as Morning Star reached for her bow, Swift Runner caught her arm with a grip that spoke of urgent warning. "Look beyond the elk," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the trees. Following his gaze, Morning Star felt her blood turn to ice in her veins. On the opposite side of the basin, partially concealed by a cluster of snow-laden boulders, were 5 riders. Even at this distance, she could make out the distinctive silhouettes of war ponies and the glint of weapons in the winter sunlight. But it was not the presence of enemies that made her breath catch in her throat. It was the realization that one of the riders had already seen them. Across the frozen basin, separated by perhaps 200 yards of open ground, an Arikara warrior sat motionless on his mount, his dark eyes fixed directly on Morning Star's hiding place. He was young, perhaps her own age, with the lean build of a born hunter and the bearing of a man who had faced death and found it wanting. Even from this distance, she could see the intelligence in his gaze, the calculating assessment of a predator who had suddenly found himself face to face with unexpected prey. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, The two groups of hunters regarded each other across the basin, each waiting for the other to make the first move. The elk continued their feeding, unaware that they had become the center of a drama that could end in blood and death for all involved. Then, with a movement so subtle it might have been a trick of the light, the Arikara warrior raised his hand not in threat, but in a gesture that Morningstar recognized with shock as a sign of peaceful intent. It was the universal signal used by all plains tribes when hunters encountered each other on neutral ground, an acknowledgement that the game belonged to whoever could take it fairly. Morningstar felt her companions tense beside her, their hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. The traditional response to encountering enemy hunters would be to either attack or withdraw, depending on the relative strength of the two parties. But something in the young Arikara's gesture, in the calm confidence of his bearing, made Morningstar hesitate. Instead of reaching for her bow, she found herself raising her own hand in response, accepting the unspoken challenge. Across the basin, she saw the warrior's face change, surprise flickering across his features as he realized that one of the Shoshone hunters was a woman. But rather than mocking laughter or dismissive gestures, she saw something else in his expression: respect. And perhaps the beginning of something far more dangerous. The hunt that followed was unlike anything Morningstar had ever experienced. What should have been a simple matter of stalking and killing became an intricate dance between two groups of hunters, each trying to outmaneuver the other while avoiding actions that would scatter the elk entirely. It was a contest of skill, patience, and cunning that transformed the frozen basin into an arena where only the most gifted would claim victory. Morningstar moved through the trees like a spirit, her years of secret practice serving her now as she positioned herself for the perfect shot. But always she was aware of the Arikara warrior's presence, of the way he moved with fluid grace through the shadows, of the deadly precision with which he handled his own bow. They were evenly matched, two predators at the peak of their abilities, and the realization sent a thrill through her that had nothing to do with the hunt itself. The decisive moment came when a massive bull elk, his antlers spanning wider than a man could reach, stepped into a small clearing between the two groups of hunters. Both Morningstar and the Arikara warrior had clear shots, their arrows nocked and drawn, their aim steady despite the distance and the cold that made their fingers numb. For a heartbeat, they looked at each other across the clearing, and Morningstar saw her own reflection in the warrior's dark eyes, the same hunger, the same need, the same recognition that this moment would define something important about who they were and who they might become. Then, in a movement that defied explanation, Morningstar shifted her aim slightly, sending her arrow into the elk's shoulder while the Arikara's shot took the great beast through the heart. The elk fell in a spray of crimson against the white snow, and in that moment, Morningstar realized that she had just done something that would change her life forever. She had chosen cooperation over conflict, had shared a kill with an enemy warrior, had acknowledged kinship with someone her people would consider a mortal foe. As the implications of her actions crashed over her like an avalanche, Morningstar heard Swift Runner's sharp intake of breath behind her and knew that her world had just become infinitely more complicated. The silence that followed the elk's death was more deafening than thunder. Morningstar stood frozen in the crystalline air, her bow still trembling in her hands as the full magnitude of what she had done crashed over her like an avalanche. She had not merely shared a kill with an enemy, she had chosen to trust an Arikara warrior over the ancient hatred that had flowed like poison between their peoples for generations beyond counting. Swift Runner's voice cut through the stillness like a blade dragged across stone. "What have you done?" His words carried the weight of prophecy and condemnation, and Morningstar could hear in them the echo of her own doom. Across the basin, the Arikara warrior was already moving toward the fallen elk, his movements fluid and purposeful despite the tension that crackled through the air like lightning before a storm. His four companions remained mounted, their weapons ready but not raised, their dark eyes fixed on Morning Star with an intensity that made her skin crawl. But it was the young warrior himself who commanded her attention. The way he approached the elk with the reverence due to a fallen brother, the graceful economy of his movements as he knelt beside the massive animal and placed his hand on its still warm flank. When he looked up at her across the blood-stained snow, Morning Star felt something shift deep in her chest like tectonic plates grinding against each other. His face was painted with the sacred symbols of the hunt, white clay mixed with red ochre that traced the path of the elk's spirit from earth to sky. But beneath the ritual markings, she could see features that spoke of nobility, intelligence, and a kind of fierce honor that her own warriors would have recognized and respected in different circumstances. He spoke then, his voice carrying clearly across the frozen basin despite the wind that whistled through the cottonwoods like the voices of ancient ghosts. I am Stone Bear of the Arikara, son of Chief Charging Bull, keeper of the winter count that records our people's journey through the seasons of blood and plenty. His English was accented but precise, learned perhaps from traders or missionaries who had ventured into Arikara territory. You hunt with the skill of one blessed by the spirits, daughter of the Shoshone. What name do you carry? Young Hawk hissed, in alarm beside her. Do not answer him. To speak your true name to an enemy is to give him power over your spirit. But Morning Star found herself stepping forward, drawn by something she could not name or resist. I am Morning Star, daughter of Chief Red Hawk, she who runs with the elk and speaks the language of the wind. The words left her lips before she could call them back, and she saw Stone Bear's eyes widen with something that might have been recognition or prophecy. Morning Star, he repeated, and the way he spoke her name made it sound like a prayer or an incantation. The one who appears just before dawn breaks, herald of the new day. He gestured toward the elk that lay between them like an offering on an altar. The spirits have brought us together for a purpose, I think. This elk belongs to both of us, killed by 2 arrows shot with one heart. Gray Wolf's voice cracked like a whip through the charged air. We do not share kills with dog-eating Arikara. Take your portion and go before we forget the laws of the hunt and remember only the laws of war. Stone Bear's companions stirred restlessly at the insult, their hands tightening on their weapons. Morning Star could see the situation balanced on a knife's edge, one wrong word away from dissolving into the kind of blood-soaked chaos that would leave the basin littered with corpses and the elk, forgotten in the snow. But Stone Bear himself remained calm, his dark eyes never leaving Morning Star's face. Your warriors speak with the voices of the past, he said quietly. But you, Morning Star who heralds the dawn, what does your heart tell you? The question hit her like a physical blow, stripping away the comfortable certainties of tribal loyalty and ancient hatred to expose something raw and vulnerable at her core. What did her heart tell her? It told her that this young Arikara warrior moved like poetry given form, that his eyes held depths she wanted to explore, that when he spoke her name it sounded like music she had been waiting her entire life to hear. My heart tells me that the elk died to feed the hungry, not to start a war, she replied, her voice steady despite the chaos of emotions churning within her. If your people need meat as badly as mine do, then perhaps the spirits mean for us to remember that we are all children of the same earth. The words hung in the frigid air like smoke from a sacred fire, and Morning Star could feel the shocked silence of her companions, pressing against her back like a physical weight. She had just suggested something that bordered on heresy, that Shoshone and Arikara might have common ground, that the ancient enmities that had shaped their people's identities might be less important than their shared humanity. Stone Bear rose from beside the elk, and Morning Star was struck by his height, the breadth of his shoulders beneath his winter robes, the way he carried himself with the unconscious pride of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. Wisdom speaks through the mouth of the Dawn Herald, he said formally. Let us divide the elk according to the old laws of the hunt, And let our peoples remember that even enemies can honor each other when the spirits demand it. The butchering that followed was unlike anything Morning Star had ever experienced. Working side by side with Stone Bear, their hands sometimes touching as they made precise cuts through hide and muscle, she felt as though she were participating in some ancient ritual that predated the feuds and wars that had divided their peoples. He was skilled with his blade, his movements economical and respectful, and when he carved the traditional hunter's portion from the elk's heart and offered it to her on the point of his knife, she accepted it without hesitation. The raw meat was warm and rich with life, and as she chewed it, Morning Star felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of herself and her place in the world. She was no longer simply the daughter of Chief Red Hawk, the rebellious woman who hunted when she should have been weaving baskets. She was something new, something unprecedented, a bridge between worlds that had been kept separate by generations of bloodshed and misunderstanding. As they worked, Stone Bear spoke of his people, his voice low and melodious as he painted pictures with words of Arikara villages along the Missouri River, of earth lodges that rose like hills from the prairie, of corn fields that stretched to the horizon and gardens where squash and beans grew in sacred patterns, taught by the corn mothers of ancient times. He spoke of drought and disease, of white soldiers who came with promises and left with treaties written in Arikara blood, of a people struggling to survive in a world that seemed determined to erase them from existence. "We are not so different, your people and mine," he said as he wrapped portions of meat in hide bundles with the practiced efficiency of one who had hunted since childhood. "We both love our children, mourn our dead, and hope for a future where the young can grow old in peace." Morning Star found herself nodding, drawn deeper into conversation despite the increasingly agitated stirring of her companions. "My father speaks often of the old days when the buffalo were so numerous they darkened the plains like storm clouds. He says those days will never return, that we must learn to live in a smaller world or perish from it." "Your father is wise," Stone Bear replied. "Mine says the same thing. He dreams of a time when Arikara and Shoshone might hunt together, when our children might play the same games and learn the same songs." He paused in his work, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "He dreams of marriages that would bind our peoples together like strands in a rope, making us strong enough to resist those who would see us all swept away like leaves before the winter wind." The implications of his words struck Morning Star like lightning, illuminating possibilities that she had never dared to imagine. Marriage between tribal enemies was not unheard of. It had been used for generations as a tool of diplomacy, a way to seal alliances and end blood feuds. But the idea that she, the rebellious daughter who had defied every tradition simply to hunt, might become the bridge between Shoshone and Arikara was so audacious it made her head spin. Before she could respond, Swift Runner's harsh voice shattered the intimate moment like a stone through glass. "Enough of this madness. We came here to hunt, not to listen to Arikara lies and deceptions. Take your meat and go, dog eaters, before we forget the laws of hospitality and remember the duty we owe to our ancestors' ghosts." Stone Bear's companions had been growing increasingly restless during the conversation, and Swift Runner's insult finally pushed them beyond endurance. They surged forward, weapons raised, their war cries echoing off the canyon walls like the screams of hunting eagles. But Stone Bear himself moved with shocking speed, placing himself between his warriors and Morning Star, his own blade flashing in the winter sunlight as he deflected a blow meant for her throat. "Stop," he commanded, and the authority in his voice froze his companions in place as surely as if he had struck them with war clubs. "This woman is under my protection. Any who would harm her must first kill me." The declaration hit the assembled warriors like a thunderclap, and Morning Star felt the ground shift beneath her feet as she realized what Stone Bear had just done. By claiming her as someone under his protection, He had essentially declared his romantic interest in terms that every warrior present would understand. It was a challenge, a statement of intent, and a commitment that could only end in marriage. Or death. Grey Wolf's face twisted with rage and disbelief. You dare claim protection over a Shoshone woman? Your arrogance knows no bounds, Arikara dog. I claim nothing, Stone Bear replied calmly, though Morning Star could see the tension. Coiled in his muscles like a spring under pressure. I offer what is mine to give, the shelter of my name, the strength of my arm, the devotion of my heart. If Morning Star chooses to accept these gifts, then let no man say she chose unwisely. The formal challenge hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire, and Morning Star knew that everything that happened next would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of both their peoples. She could accept Stone Bear's protection and become an outcast from her own tribe, or she could reject it and watch as the fragile moment of understanding they had built together crumbled into violence and bloodshed. But before she could speak, young Hawk's bow sang like a harp string, and Stone Bear staggered backward with an arrow buried deep in his shoulder. Blood spread across his winter robes like spilled paint, and his face went pale with shock and pain. No, Morning Star's scream echoed off the canyon walls as she threw herself toward Stone Bear, catching him as he fell to his knees in the blood-stained snow. His weight was solid and warm against her, and she could feel his life flowing out between her fingers as she pressed her hands against the wound. The basin erupted into chaos as both groups of warriors surged toward each other, their war cries mingling with the clash of weapons and the wet sound of blades finding flesh. But Morning Star heard none of it, focused entirely on the man bleeding in her arms. His dark eyes clouded with pain, but still fixed on her face with an intensity that stole her breath. "Promise me," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sounds of battle. From somewhere in his robes he produced a small object carved from bone, a medicine wheel inlaid with turquoise and silver, the kind of sacred artifact that was passed down through generations of Arikara warriors. "Promise me you will wait for me, no matter what they do to us, no matter how long it takes. I will come back for you, Morning Star. I will honor the vow we made beside the elk's body." She took the medicine wheel with trembling fingers, feeling its power like electricity against her skin. "I promise," she whispered back, sealing her fate with 2 words that would echo through years of separation and suffering. "I will wait for you, Stone Bear. Until the stars fall from the sky, I will wait." He smiled then, and even through his pain, it was like watching sunrise break over the mountains. "Then I will live," he said simply. "For you, I will find a way to live." The battle was brief but savage, ending when Swift Runner's war cry announced victory over the Arikara warriors. 3 of Stone Bear's companions lay dead in the snow, their blood steaming in the cold air, while the 4th had fled on horseback, carrying word of the encounter back to his people. Stone Bear himself had been captured, though his wound was severe enough that Morning Star wondered if he would survive the journey to wherever. Swift Runner planned to take him as the Shoshone warriors bound their prisoner with strips of rawhide. Morning Star felt her world collapsing around her like a lodge struck by lightning. She had broken every law of her people, betrayed every tradition that had shaped her identity, and fallen in love with a man whose very existence had just become a death sentence for them both. Swift Runner's voice cut through her despair like a blade through silk. "You will say nothing of what happened here. We encountered Arikara raiders, killed 3, captured 1. That is the story we will tell, and if you value your life and the lives of your family, you will make it your truth as well." But Morning Star barely heard him, her attention focused entirely on Stone Bear, as he was hauled to his feet and thrown across the back of a pack horse like a bundle of meat. Their eyes met one last time across the blood-stained snow, and she saw in his gaze a promise that transcended words, a vow that would bind them together across whatever darkness was to come. As the hunting party prepared to leave the basin, Morning. Star tucked the medicine wheel deep inside her robes, feeling its weight against her heart like a second heartbeat. She had made her choice, and now she would have to live with the consequences. But somewhere in the depths of her soul, she knew that what had been forged between her and Stone Bear, in the shadow of the fallen elk, was stronger than tribal hatred, deeper than ancient law, and more enduring than the winter that surrounded them. Like a shroud dot, the journey back to the Shoshone camp passed in a haze of dread and desperate hope. Stone Bear rode in silence, his wound seeping blood that left a trail of crimson drops in the snow, but his eyes remained alert and calculating. Morning Star could see him studying their route, memorizing landmarks, preparing for an escape attempt that might be his only chance at survival. When they finally crested the ridge that overlooked the winter camp, Morning Star felt her heart sink at the sight of the lodge circle below. Smoke rose from the central fires like prayers ascending to an indifferent sky, and she could see her people moving about their daily tasks with the mechanical persistence of those who had learned to endure without hope. Soon, very soon, that fragile peace would be shattered by the revelation of what she had done, and the consequences would ripple through the camp like stones thrown into still water. As they descended toward the lodges, Morning Star touched the medicine wheel hidden against her heart and whispered a prayer to whatever spirits might still be listening. She had chosen love over loyalty, hope over hatred, and now she would discover whether such choices could survive in a world built on the bones of ancient enemies. The last thing she saw before they entered the camp was Stone Bear's face, turned toward her with an expression of such fierce determination that it took her breath away. He had promised to come back for her, and looking into his eyes, Morning Star realized that she believed him completely. Whatever happened next, whatever price they both had to pay for their forbidden love, he would find a way to honor his vow. The only question was whether either of them would survive long enough to make that reunion possible. The war drums began, beating before dawn, their deep thrumming echoing across the Wind River Valley like the heartbeat of an angry god. Morning Star woke to their ominous rhythm, her body drenched in cold sweat as the events of the previous day crashed over her like an avalanche of memory and dread. The medicine wheel pressed against her chest felt heavier than stone, its carved bone surface warm with the heat of her racing heart. Through the buffalo hide walls of her father's lodge, she could hear the camp stirring to life with an urgency that spoke of crisis. Warriors called to each other in voices tight with anticipation. Horses snorted and stamped as they were saddled for war, and beneath it all, the drums continued their relentless beat, summoning the tribe to judgment. Chief Red Hawk entered the lodge with the heavy step of a man carrying the weight of impossible decisions. His weathered face was carved from granite, but Morning Star could see the pain flickering in his dark eyes like firelight reflected in deep water. He had aged years in the single night since her return, the burden of his daughter's transgression settling onto his shoulders like a mountain of responsibility he was no longer sure he could bear. "They are calling for your blood," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a leader who had spent the dark hours arguing with men whose hearts had turned to stone. "Iron Crow and the War Council believe you have brought a curse upon our people. They say the Arikara prisoner speaks of you as if you were his woman, that you shared sacred rituals with him beside the elk's body." Morning Star's blood turned to ice in her veins. Stone Bear had revealed their connection, had spoken of what passed between them in terms that left no room for interpretation or denial. She could imagine him, wounded and bound, facing the hostile questions of Shoshone interrogators with the same fierce honesty that had made her fall in love with him, beside a dead elk in the snow. "What did he tell them?" she whispered, though part of her already knew the answer would seal her doom. Chief Red Hawk's expression grew even more grave. "He told them that the spirits brought you together, that your arrows found the elk with one heart, that he offered you the protection of his name and the devotion of his soul. He paused, studying his daughter's face with eyes that missed nothing. He told them you accepted his medicine wheel and swore to wait for his return. No matter how long it might take. The lodge seemed to spin around Morning Star as the full implications hit her like physical blows. Stone Bear had not only confessed their forbidden love, he had described it in terms that made it sound like a formal betrothal ceremony, conducted according to sacred laws that transcended tribal boundaries. In the eyes of her people, she had not simply betrayed them for an enemy. She had married that enemy in a ritual that made her as much Arikara as Shoshone. "Father," she began, but he raised his hand for silence. "There is more," he said, and his voice carried a weight that made her soul shrink within her chest. "The Arikara who escaped has returned with 50 warriors. They camp now at the mouth of the valley, and their war chief flies the red banner. That means they will have satisfaction, or they will have war. They demand the return of Stone Bear, son of Chief Charging Bull, grandson of the medicine keeper White Elk. They say he is promised to the daughter of Chief Red Hawk, and they have come to collect both him and his bride." Morning Star felt the ground beneath her feet turn to quicksand as she realized the magnitude of what had been set in motion. The Arikara had not come as raiders or conquerors. They had come as kinsmen, following the ancient protocols that governed the retrieval of stolen family members. In their eyes, Stone Bear was not a prisoner of war, but a bridegroom separated from his intended wife by tribal politics and misunderstanding. "The War Council meets at sunrise," Chief Red Hawk continued. "They will decide your fate and that of the Arikara prisoner. Iron Crow calls for your exile, to be driven into the wilderness with only the clothes on your back. Others speak of worse punishments, of burning out the stain you have brought upon our honor with brands and blades." Morning Star's hand moved instinctively to the medicine wheel hidden beneath her dress, drawing strength from its carved surface. "And Stone Bear? What will they do to him?" Her father's silence was more eloquent than words, but finally he spoke. The truth that hung between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. "He will die. Slowly, as befits one who has stolen the heart of a chief's daughter and brought war to our winter camp. Iron Crow has already begun preparing the stakes and the coals." The image struck Morning Star like a physical blow, and she doubled over as if her father had driven a lance through her chest. Stone Bear, who had moved like poetry through the snow, who had spoken her name like a prayer, who had carved his sacred medicine wheel with hands that had touched her face with infinite gentleness, that beautiful, noble warrior would be tortured to death while she watched, his screams echoing across the valley like the cries of her own dying heart. "No," she whispered, then louder, with a strength that surprised them both. "No, I will not allow it. Chief." Red Hawk's weathered face hardened with the expression of a man who had heard those words from his daughter too many times to count. "You will allow nothing. You have no voice in this council, no power to change what you have set in motion. You chose to hunt with enemies, to share sacred rituals with those who would see our children scalped, and our women carried off as slaves. Now you must live with the consequences of that choice." But Morning Star was already moving, her mind racing with desperate plans and impossible hopes. "The Arikara warriors at the mouth of the valley, they came for Stone Bear, but they also came for me. In their eyes I am already his wife, already one of their people. If I go to them willingly, you would become what you are accused of being," her father finished, his voice heavy with the weight of prophecy. "A traitor who chose enemies over blood, a woman who turned her back on everything that made her who she is." Morning Star stopped pacing and faced her father across the lodge, seeing in his weathered features the echo of her own stubborn determination, the same fire that had driven him to become a war chief in his youth. "Perhaps that is exactly what I need to become," she said quietly. "Perhaps the old ways, the ancient hatreds, the endless cycle of revenge and bloodshed, perhaps all of that needs to die so something new can be born." Chief Red Hawk stared at his daughter as if seeing her for the first time. recognizing in her words the same revolutionary spirit that had once driven their people to leave the eastern woodlands and claim the vast territories of the West. You would sacrifice everything, your name, your people, your place in the spirit world of our ancestors for one man? I would sacrifice everything for the hope that our children might grow up in a world where Shoshone and Arikara hunt together. Instead of hunting each other, Morning Star replied, her voice steady with conviction. Stone Bear spoke of his father's dreams, of marriages that would bind our peoples together like strands in a rope. What if those dreams could become reality? What if our love could be the first thread in that rope? The silence that followed her words was broken only by the distant sound of the war drums, their rhythm now joined by the harsh voices of men preparing for battle. Chief Red Hawk studied his daughter's face with the intensity of a shaman reading. Omens in the flight of eagles, searching for signs of madness or divine inspiration. Finally he spoke, and his words carried the weight of a man who had just watched his world shift on its foundations. If you choose this path, there can be no return. The council will declare you dead to the tribe, your name will be struck from the winter count, and your spirit will wander homeless between worlds. Are you prepared to pay such a price? Morning Star thought of Stone Bear's dark eyes, of the way he had moved through the snow like a force of nature, of the promise he had carved into her soul with his medicine wheel and his vow to return for her, no matter what obstacles stood in their way. I am prepared, she said simply. The war council convened as the sun painted the eastern peaks with blood and gold, its light streaming through the smoke of the central fire like the breath of ancient spirits. The greatest warriors of the tribe gathered in a circle of grim faces and crossed arms, their weapons laid across their knees in the traditional display of readiness for judgment or battle. At their center sat Iron Crow, his scarred face twisted with the satisfaction of a man who had finally found justification for opinions he had held since childhood. Morning Star entered the circle with her head high and her spine straight, wearing her finest dress and the eagle feathers that marked her as the daughter of a chief. But it was the object she carried in her hands that drew gasps of shock and outrage from the assembled warriors. Stone Bear's medicine wheel, held openly for all to see, its carved bone surface gleaming with sacred power. Behold, Iron Crow's voice cracked like a whip across the morning air, the proof of her betrayal, displayed without shame or remorse. She carries the marriage token of our enemies, as if it were a badge of honor rather than a mark of disgrace. Young Hawk, whose arrow had wounded Stone Bear, rose to his feet with the righteous fury of one who believed himself the instrument of divine justice. She shared the sacred hunt with Arikara dogs, accepted their heathen rituals, and betrayed the trust of warriors who followed her into danger. The punishment for such treachery has been written in our laws since the time of the first fathers. But before the accusations could continue, a commotion outside the council circle announced the arrival of unexpected visitors. 3 Arikara warriors entered the camp under a flag of truce, their weapons sheathed, but their bearing proud and uncompromising. At their head walked a man whose presence commanded attention like a force of nature, Chief Charging Bull himself, Stone Bear's father. His massive frame draped in ceremonial robes and his weathered face painted with the sacred symbols of diplomatic immunity, the Arikara chief spoke, in the formal cadences of one delivering words that had been chosen with the precision of arrows, aimed at the heart. I come for my son, Stone Bear of the Arikara, and for the woman who has accepted his medicine wheel according to the ancient laws that govern all peoples of the plains. She is no longer Shoshone by her own choice, but Arikara by right of marriage. I claim her as daughter of my lodge and demand safe passage for both her and my son. The challenge hung in the frigid air like smoke from a signal fire, and Morning Star felt the weight of history pressing down upon the council circle. This was no longer simply a matter of tribal justice or personal betrayal. It had become a test of competing legal systems, a collision between the internal laws of the Shoshone tribe and the broader diplomatic protocols that governed relationships. Between all plains peoples, Iron Crow's face purpled with rage at the audacity of the Arikara chief's demand. You dare to claim one of our own? This woman was born Shoshone, raised Shoshone, and will die Shoshone regardless of what tokens she may have accepted from your dog-eating son. But Chief Charging Bull remained unmoved by the insult, his dark eyes fixed on Morning Star with an intensity that seemed to pierce through to her very soul. The laws are older than tribal hatred, he replied calmly. When a woman accepts a warrior's medicine wheel and swears to wait for his return, she becomes his wife in the eyes of all spirits, human and divine. Would the Shoshone break laws that have governed our people since the world was young? The debate that followed raged like a prairie fire through the council circle, with warriors on both sides citing precedents and invoking sacred traditions in support of their positions. Some spoke of the absolute nature of tribal loyalty, arguing that no individual choice could supersede the bonds of blood and birth. Others pointed to the diplomatic implications of denying the validity of marriage ceremonies that had been recognized by plains tribes for countless generations, but it was Morning Star herself who finally broke the deadlock, rising to her feet. With the medicine wheel held high above her head like a standard carried into battle. I choose, she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the sudden silence. I choose to honor the vow I made beside the body of the sacred elk, to follow the path that the spirits revealed to me in that moment of shared hunt and shared heart. She turned to face her father, seeing in his weathered features the pain of a man watching his daughter walk away from everything he had hoped to give her. I am no longer Morning Star of the Shoshone, she declared, each word falling like a stone into still water. I am Morning Star of the Arikara, wife to Stone Bear, daughter to Chief Charging Bull, bound by laws older than the mountains themselves. The silence that followed her declaration was absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind through the lodge poles and the distant cry of an eagle circling overhead. Then Iron Crow rose to his feet, his scarred face twisted with fury and disbelief. So be it, he snarled. Let her be dead to us, her name forgotten, her spirit cast out to wander homeless between worlds. And let the Arikara dog she claims as husband die slowly beside the torture stakes, as befits one who has stolen the daughter of a chief. But Chief Charging Bull's response was swift and implacable. If my son dies, then 50 Arikara warriors will paint their faces black and sing the death songs that mean war without mercy or quarter. Is the Shoshone tribe prepared to face such consequences for the sake of revenge? The threat hung in the air like a blade poised to fall, and Morning Star could see the conflict warring in her father's weathered features. He was a chief first and a father second, responsible for the lives of 300 souls who looked to him for leadership and protection. The choice before him was stark and terrible: release his daughter and her Arikara lover to preserve the peace, or watch his people pay in blood for his personal need for justice. Finally, Chief Red Hawk spoke, and his words carried the weight of a man who had just sacrificed his own heart on the altar of leadership. The woman who calls herself Morning Star is no daughter of mine. Take her and the Arikara prisoner, and go, before the sun sets and my warriors forget the laws of hospitality. As Chief Charging Bull's men moved to release Stone Bear from his bonds, Morning Star felt the final threads connecting her to her old life snap like overstressed bowstrings. She was no longer Shoshone, no longer the rebellious daughter who had defied tradition to hunt in the high country. She had become something new and unprecedented, a bridge between worlds, a woman whose choices would echo through generations yet unborn. When Stone Bear emerged from the prisoner's lodge, pale from blood loss, but walking under his own power, his eyes found hers across the council circle with an intensity that stopped her breath. Despite his wounds, despite the ordeal of captivity and interrogation, He moved toward her with the same fluid grace that had first captured her attention beside the frozen elk. "You came for me," he said softly as they met in the center of the circle, his words carrying wonder and gratitude in equal measure. "I kept my promise," she replied, placing the medicine wheel in his hands and feeling the completion of something that had begun in blood and snow. "As you will keep yours." As the small party of Arikara warriors prepared to leave the Shoshone camp, Morning Star took one last look at the lodge circle that had been her world for 19 winters. She saw her father standing beside the council fire, his weathered face carved from stone, but his eyes bright with unshed tears. She saw Iron Crow and the war chiefs, their expressions promising that this day would be remembered as long as stories were told around winter fires. But most importantly, she saw the future stretching ahead like an untraveled trail, full of dangers and uncertainties, but also bright with the promise of something unprecedented, a love that had transcended tribal boundaries, a choice that might reshape the relationships between peoples who had been enemies since time immemorial. As they rode away from the Wind River Valley, Morning Star pressed close to Stone Bear on his war pony, feeling his strength gradually returning and his wounds beginning to heal. Behind them, the Shoshone drums fell silent, and ahead of them, the vast expanse of the Great Plains stretched toward horizons that seemed to promise redemption, renewal, and the chance to build something entirely new from the ashes of ancient hatred. The Missouri River flowed like liquid copper beneath the autumn sun, its surface broken by the passage of countless buffalo herds, whose hoofprints had worn ancient trails into the earth along both banks. Morning Star stood on the bluffs overlooking the water, her hands pressed against the growing curve of her belly, feeling the child within her move like a swimmer testing the boundaries of a too-small pool. 6 moons had passed since she had walked away from her Shoshone identity, and in that time, her body had become home to something that was neither fully Arikara nor fully Shoshone, but something entirely new. Below her, the Arikara village spread along the riverbank like a living thing, its earth lodges rising from the prairie like hills crowned with smoke and prayer. The corn was tall in the carefully tended fields, the squash plants spread their broad leaves across the rich bottom land, and the sound of children's laughter mixed with the calls of women working at their daily tasks. It should have felt like home, but for Morning Star, it remained a place of exile, beautiful but alien, welcoming but forever marked by the absence of everything she had lost. Stone Bear emerged from the sweat lodge at the village's eastern edge, his body gleaming with moisture and sacred herbs, his shoulder bearing the puckered scar where young Hawk's arrow had nearly claimed his life. The wound had healed cleanly, but it had left him with a slight weakness in his left arm that he worked to overcome through constant practice with bow and lance. He moved up the bluff toward her with the patient determination of a man who had learned that recovery, like love, was a process that could not be rushed. "The child grows strong," he said softly, placing his hand beside hers on the swell of her belly. "He kicks like a warrior already testing his strength against the world." Morning Star leaned into his warmth, drawing comfort from his presence, while her spirit remained troubled by dreams that visited her sleep like unwelcome guests. "In my vision last night, I saw eagles circling above a field of snow that was stained with blood. The medicine woman says it means danger approaches our child from the direction of the rising sun." Stone Bear's jaw tightened with concern. Singing Crow, the village's eldest medicine woman, had been having similar visions for weeks, images of soldiers marching beneath strange banners, of treaties signed in blood and broken before the ink could dry, of a great darkness spreading across the plains like wildfire consuming dry grass. The signs all pointed toward a reckoning that would test not just their love, but the survival of their people. "My father calls another council tonight," Stone Bear said, his voice carrying undertones of worry that made Morning Star's heart race with foreboding. "Runners have brought word from the agencies in the east. The whites speak of a new treaty, one that would move all the river tribes to reservations in the Indian Territory far to the south. Morning Star felt the blood drain from her face as the implication struck her like physical blows. The Indian Territory was a place of exile where defeated tribes were sent to die slowly of starvation and despair. Their traditional ways of life, systematically destroyed by government agents who believed that the only good Indian was one who had been stripped of everything that made him Indian. To be sent there would mean the death of everything the Arikara had built along the Missouri, their Earth Lodge villages, their sacred cornfields, their connection to the river that had sustained them for countless generations. "What does Chief Charging Bull say?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. Stone Bear was quiet for a long moment, watching the river flow past with the inexorable power of time itself. "He speaks of resistance, of allying with the Lakota and the Northern Cheyenne who have refused to accept reservation life. But he also knows that such a path leads inevitably to war, and war means the destruction of everything we have tried to protect." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation, and Morning Star looked down to see a dust cloud rising from the eastern trail that connected their village to the trading posts and military forts that dotted the Missouri River Valley. As the riders drew closer, she could make out the blue uniforms of cavalry soldiers, their weapons gleaming in the afternoon sunlight like the teeth of predators scenting blood. But it was not the soldiers themselves that made Morning Star's heart stop. It was the figure riding at their head, unmistakable even at this distance. Chief Red Hawk sat his warhorse with the same proud bearing that had made him a legend among the Shoshone, but now his weathered face was painted with the sacred symbols of one who had come to parley under a flag of truce. Beside him rode Swift, Runner, and Gray Wolf, the same warriors who had witnessed her forbidden love and carried word of her betrayal back to the Wind River Valley. "My father," Morning Star whispered, the words carrying all the pain and longing that 6 moons of separation had carved into her soul. "He has come." Stone Bear's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with the unconscious ease of lovers who had learned to draw strength from each other in times of crisis. "The question is whether he comes as a father seeking his daughter or as a chief negotiating with enemies." The delegation that entered the Arikara village was unlike anything the river people had seen before. Shoshone warriors riding beside Use cavalry, traditional enemies united by circumstances that transcended their ancient animosities. At their head, Chief Red Hawk dismounted with the careful movements of a man who had aged years in the months since his daughter's exile, his weathered face bearing new lines of worry and responsibility. Chief Charging Bull met the delegation in the village's central plaza, surrounded by his own warriors and elders, the formal protocols of diplomacy creating an invisible barrier between the two groups of armed men. But when Red Hawk's eyes found Morning Star in the crowd, something fundamental shifted in his expression, the mask of diplomatic neutrality cracking to reveal the raw pain of a father who had been forced to choose between duty and love. "I come, bearing words from the Great Father in Washington," Red Hawk announced, his voice carrying the formal cadences of one delivering a message he had been ordered to repeat precisely. "The Arikara and all river tribes must remove themselves to the Indian Territory before the snow flies, or face the consequences of defying the United States government." The words hit the assembled Arikara like physical blows, and Morning Star could hear the sharp intake of breath from dozens of throats as the full implication sank in. This was not merely a treaty negotiation, it was an ultimatum backed by the threat of military force. A demand for complete surrender disguised as diplomatic courtesy. Chief Charging Bull's response was measured but carried undertones of steel. That made even the cavalry soldiers shift nervously in their saddles. "And if we refuse this generous offer to abandon the lands that have been ours since the world was young, what consequences does the Great Father propose?" The cavalry captain, a lean man with the hard eyes of one who had seen too much frontier violence, spoke for the first time. The consequences are simple, Chief. Submit to removal, or face the combined might of the U.S. Army and our Indian allies. The choice is yours, but the result will be the same either way. It was then that Red Hawk made a gesture that shocked everyone present. He removed the eagle feather war bonnet that marked his status as a Shoshone war chief and placed it on the ground between the two groups of leaders. "I did not come here as the Great Father's messenger," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I came as a father seeking his daughter, and as a man who has learned that some things matter more than the orders of distant bureaucrats." The revelation sent a ripple of shock through both groups of warriors, but it was Morning Star who felt the greatest impact. Her father had not come as an agent of the U.S. government. He had come to warn them of what was approaching, to offer them the chance to prepare for the storm that was about to break over the plains like a tornado spawned from the very gates of hell. "The Army assembles at Fort Lincoln even now," Red Hawk continued, his words carrying the weight of intelligence gathered at great personal risk. 3 regiments of cavalry, 2 of infantry, and artillery enough to level every earth lodge on the Missouri. They march within the week, and they carry orders to accept nothing less than complete submission or complete destruction. Chief Charging Bull's weathered face remained impassive, but Morning Star could see the calculations racing behind his dark eyes, the mathematics of warfare that weighed warrior strength against military might, traditional tactics against modern weapons, the survival of his people against the preservation of their way of life. "Why do you bring us this warning?" Charging Bull asked quietly. "Your daughter chose to become Arikara, but you remain Shoshone. What do you gain by betraying the agreements you have made with the white soldiers?" Red Hawk's eyes found Morning Star across the plaza, and in them she saw all the love and regret that had accumulated during their months of separation. "I gained the chance to save my grandchild from growing up in a world where love is counted as treason and courage is measured by the willingness to destroy everything that makes life worth living." The words hit Morning Star like lightning, illuminating truths she had been afraid to acknowledge. Her father had not come to drag her back to the Shoshone. He had come to help her survive in the world she had chosen, to ensure that his grandchild would have the chance to grow up free rather than dying in the spiritual wasteland of a government reservation. The council that followed lasted through the night, with warriors and elders debating options that all seemed to lead toward disaster. Some spoke of fighting, of making the army pay such a terrible price for victory that other tribes would be left in peace. Others argued for submission, for the slim hope that reservation life might at least preserve some remnant of their people for future generations. But it was Stone Bear who finally gave voice to the desperate plan that had been growing in the minds of many. "There is another path," he said, rising to address the assembled leaders. "North, beyond the Milk River, the British Queen's law still protects those who seek refuge from American soldiers. Sitting Bull and his Lakota have found sanctuary there, and the Queen's red coats honor their promises in ways that American politicians do not." The suggestion sent a murmur of possibility through the council, but also unleashed a flood of practical objections. The journey to British territory was more than 300 miles across hostile terrain, through the hunting grounds of tribes who might see fleeing Arikara as either allies or enemies, depending on the shifting politics of survival. Winter was approaching, and traveling with the entire village, including elders, children, and pregnant women like Morning Star, would be a logistical nightmare that could easily become a death march. "The risks are enormous," Chief Charging Bull acknowledged. "Many would die on such a journey, and there is no guarantee the British would accept us even if we survived to reach their territory." But Red Hawk leaned forward, his weathered features animated by a desperate hope. "I know the northern trails, the hidden water sources, the places where small groups can find shelter from both weather and enemies. My warriors and I could guide you, help you reach safety before the army moves." The offer hung in the smoky air of the council, lodged like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Red Hawk was proposing not just to help his daughter escape, but to abandon his own people and his position as a U.S. government ally to lead an entire enemy tribe to safety. It was an act of such monumental courage and sacrifice that it left even the most experienced warriors speechless. Morning Star felt the child in her womb kick violently, as if responding to the tension that filled the lodge like electricity before a thunderstorm. This was the moment of ultimate choice, not just for her, but for everyone she had come to love. Stay and face certain destruction, or flee into an uncertain future that might offer salvation or might simply be a slower form of death. Stone Bear's hand found hers in the darkness, and she felt his strength flowing into her like water into parched earth. "Whatever path we choose," he whispered, "we walk it together." The vote, when it finally came, was closer than anyone had expected. The older warriors, those who remembered the time before whites came to the Missouri, voted to stay and fight, preferring death in battle to exile from the lands that held their ancestors' bones. But the younger men, those with children and wives to protect, sided with the desperate hope of escape. In the end, it was Chief Charging Bull's decision that tipped the balance. "We are not the first people to face such choices," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of leadership. "Our ancestors crossed vast waters to reach this land, and perhaps their spirits call us to cross vast distances once again. We will attempt the journey north, and may the Great Spirit guide our steps." As the council dissolved and the villagers began the frantic preparations for exodus, Morning Star found herself alone with her father for the first time since her exile. They stood on the bluff overlooking the Missouri, watching the river flow past with the same patient persistence it had shown for countless generations. "I thought I had lost you forever," Red Hawk said quietly, his voice thick with emotions he had kept buried for months. "When you walked away from our council circle, I felt as though part of my own spirit had been torn away." Morning Star leaned against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his familiar presence while her heart ached with the knowledge of what her choices had cost them both. "I am still your daughter," she whispered. "Distance and tribal boundaries cannot change that." Red Hawk's weathered hand rested gently on her swollen belly, feeling the movement of the child within. "This grandchild will grow up knowing both peoples, carrying the best of Shoshone and Arikara in his blood. Perhaps that is the future, not the death of the old ways, but their transformation into something new and stronger." As they stood together, watching the sun set over the river that had sustained the Arikara for generations, Morning Star felt a strange sense of completion, as if the circle that had been broken by her exile was finally beginning to heal. The journey ahead would be fraught with dangers that could claim all their lives, but for the first time since leaving the Wind River Valley, she felt the presence of hope, fragile as a newborn bird, but growing stronger with each beat of her heart. Tomorrow they would begin the flight toward an uncertain freedom, leaving behind everything familiar to chase a dream of sanctuary in a foreign land. But tonight, surrounded by the people she had chosen to love and protected by the father who had chosen to forgive, Morning Star allowed herself to believe that some bonds were stronger than politics, some loves deeper than tribal loyalty, and some dreams worth any sacrifice required to make them real. The Missouri River continued its ancient flow toward the sea, carrying with it the prayers and hopes of a people preparing to abandon everything they had known in pursuit of the one thing that mattered more than security, the chance to remain free. The blizzard struck 3 days out from the Milk River, descending upon the fleeing Arikara caravan like the wrath of winter spirits angered by their abandonment of sacred lands. Snow fell in sheets so thick that horses disappeared from view at arm's length, and the wind howled across the northern plains with a voice that spoke of death and desolation. Morning Star pressed herself against Stone Bear's back as their horse struggled through drifts that reached its belly, her swollen body racked with contractions that came with increasing frequency, despite her desperate attempts to will them away. The child was coming, 3 weeks before its time, in the middle of a blizzard that threatened to claim the lives of everyone in the struggling column of refugees. Around them, the ghostly shapes of other riders moved like spirits through the white chaos, their forms barely visible through the curtain of wind-driven snow. Children cried with voices that were quickly swallowed by the storm, and elders slumped in their saddles with the resigned exhaustion of those who had pushed their bodies beyond all reasonable limits. "Hold on," Stone Bear's voice was nearly lost in the wind, but Morning Star could feel the tension in his muscles as he fought to keep their mount moving forward through the deepening drifts. "We're almost to Owl Creek. There are caves there, where we can find shelter." But Morning Star knew with the terrible certainty of a woman whose body had chosen its own schedule that there would be no time for caves or shelter. The child was coming now, here in the midst of the storm, and nothing in the world could stop it. Another contraction seized her like a giant fist, and she doubled over with a cry that was torn away by the wind before Stone Bear could hear it. Through the white chaos ahead, she glimpsed the massive shape of Chief Charging Bull, his warhorse struggling through snow that reached almost to its shoulders. The old chief had refused to ride in one of the travois despite his age, insisting that a leader's place was at the head of his people, even in the face of death itself. Behind him, the long line of refugees stretched back into the storm like a caravan of ghosts, their survival dependent on the strength of horses already pushed beyond endurance. "Stone Bear," Morning Star gasped, her voice barely audible above the wind. "The baby, it's coming now." She felt him stiffen in the saddle, his warrior's training warring with the helpless terror of a man about to become a father under the worst possible circumstances. Around them, the storm raged with increasing fury, and she could hear the shouts of other riders calling out positions and warnings through the white chaos. "Red Hawk!" Stone Bear's voice cut through the wind with the desperation of a man calling upon his last hope. "Red Hawk, we need help." The response came from their left, where Morning Star's father materialized out of the blizzard like a figure from a vision, his weathered face etched with concern as he fought to bring his horse alongside theirs. One look at his daughter's condition told him everything he needed to know, and his expression shifted from worry to the grim determination of a man who had faced impossible situations before. "There's an old buffalo wallow ahead with a stand of cottonwoods that might break the wind," he shouted. "We can make a shelter there, but we'll have to work fast." The next hour passed in a blur of desperate activity as three men worked to create a windbreak in the howling storm. Using their horses' bodies as shields and stretching buffalo robes between the gnarled cottonwood trunks, they managed to carve out a small pocket of relative calm in the midst of the blizzard's fury. Snow continued to fall in thick curtains around their makeshift shelter, but at least they could hear each other speak without shouting. Morning Star lay on a bed of buffalo robes, her body racked with contractions that came with the relentless regularity of thunder following lightning. Stone Bear knelt beside her, his hands gentle despite their trembling as he tried to offer what comfort he could. But it was Chief Red Hawk who took charge of the situation with the calm efficiency of a man who had helped deliver countless foals and calves during his years as a warrior and hunter. "The child chooses its own time," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "All we can do is help it into the world and pray that the spirits watch over its first breath." Through the pain that threatened to tear her apart, Morning Star found herself thinking of all the choices that had led to this moment, the forbidden hunt that had brought her face to face with Stone Bear, the shared kill that had sealed their fate, the public renunciation of her Shoshone identity that had made her an exile from everything she had once known. Each decision had seemed impossible at the time, but now they revealed themselves as steps on a path that had always been leading to this storm-lashed shelter, where her child would take its first breath as a citizen of no nation but the vast sky itself. "I can see the head," Red Hawk announced, his weathered hands steady despite the cold that had numbed them beyond feeling. "One more push, daughter. One more, and your child will be born free under the open sky." The final contraction felt like being struck by lightning, and Morning Star's scream of pain and effort was swallowed by the wind as it echoed across the plains. Then suddenly, miraculously, there was a new sound in their small shelter, the thin, outraged cry of an infant protesting its sudden entry into a world of cold and storm. "A son," Red Hawk announced, his voice thick with emotion as he lifted the tiny, perfect form. A grandson born between worlds, belonging fully to neither but carrying the best of both. Stone Bear's hands shook as he accepted the child, his dark eyes wide with wonder and terror at the fragile life he now held. The baby was impossibly small, his skin blue with cold despite the buffalo robes that surrounded them. But his lungs were strong, and his cry pierced the storm with the defiant voice of life refusing to yield to death. "He needs warmth," Stone Bear said urgently, and Morning Star opened her dress to draw the child against her skin, feeling his tiny heart beating against her chest like a hummingbird's wings. But even as she cradled her newborn son, Morning Star could hear the sounds that meant their desperate flight was about to become even more perilous. Through the storm came the distant but unmistakable sound of horses moving at speed, and the voices that called through the wind carried the hard edge of men who had found their quarry. "Cavalry," Red Hawk said grimly, his weathered face grim, with the knowledge of what pursuit meant for their exhausted refugees. "They've caught up with us sooner than I thought possible." Stone Bear's expression hardened with the deadly calm of a warrior preparing for his final battle. "They cannot have followed our trail in this storm. Someone guided them, someone who knew exactly where we were heading." The betrayal hit Red Hawk like a physical blow, and Morning Star saw understanding dawn in his eyes with the terrible clarity of revelation. "Swift Runner," he whispered. "I trusted him with our route, and he sold that information to the cavalry commanders." The sound of approaching riders grew louder, and through the white chaos of the storm, Morning Star could make out the dark shapes of mounted soldiers emerging from the blizzard like harbingers of doom. At their head rode Captain Morrison, the same lean, hard-eyed officer who had delivered the ultimatum at the Arikara village, his face set with the grim satisfaction of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. "Chief Charging Bull." Morrison's voice cut through the wind with military authority. "By order of the United States government, you and your people will surrender immediately and submit to escort to the Indian Territory. Resistance will be met with deadly force." The old Arikara chief's response came from somewhere in the storm, his voice carrying the dignity and defiance that had made him a legend among the river tribes. "We harm no one, take nothing that is not ours, and seek only to live in peace beyond your borders. What right do you claim to hunt us like animals across this wilderness?" Morrison's laugh was as cold as the wind that howled around them. "The right of civilized men to impose order upon savages who refuse to accept the benefits of Christian civilization. You have 1 minute to surrender, or we will take you by force." It was then that Stone Bear made the decision that would define him for the rest of his life. Rising from beside Morning Star and their newborn child, he stepped out into the storm with his hands raised, but his bearing proud and uncompromising. "I am Stone Bear of the Arikara," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the wind. "I offer myself in exchange for safe passage for the women, children, and elders. Let them continue their journey north, and I will submit to whatever justice you choose to impose." The offer brought a moment of stunned silence even from the cavalry soldiers, many of whom recognized the kind of courage that transcended tribal boundaries. But it was Morning Star's voice that shattered the stillness, rising above the storm with the fierce authority of a mother protecting her child. "No!" She struggled to her feet despite her exhaustion, the baby clutched against her chest as she faced the line of mounted soldiers. "If you take him, you take us all. We are not separate pieces to be bargained away, we are family, bound by vows that your government cannot break." Captain Morrison's attention fixed on her with the predatory focus of a hawk spotting movement. In tall grass. "The half-breed woman who started this whole mess," he said with satisfaction. "Chief Red Hawk's daughter, the one who chose savages over her own people. You'll make an excellent example of what happens to white women who forget their place." But before Morrison could issue orders for their capture, the storm itself seemed to rise in defense of the small family. The wind increased to a howling fury that made it impossible for the cavalry horses to maintain their footing, and snow began falling so heavily that visibility dropped to mere yards. In the white chaos that followed, Morning Star felt strong, hands lifting her and her child, carrying them toward horses that materialized out of the blizzard like spirit animals responding to desperate prayer. "This way." Red Hawk's voice cut through the confusion as he led them toward a gap in the soldiers' line that had opened when their mounts were blinded by the driving snow. "Follow me, I know these lands better than any cavalry tracker." What followed was a desperate flight through terrain that would have been treacherous in good weather and was nearly suicidal in the midst of a blizzard. Red Hawk led them along game trails that existed more in memory than reality, following landmarks that were invisible to anyone who had not spent decades learning to read the subtle signs that marked safe passage through the northern wilderness. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit gradually faded as the cavalry found themselves lost in a white wilderness that offered no landmarks, no clear trails, and no mercy for those who ventured into it unprepared. The storm that had threatened to kill the Arikara refugees had become their salvation, hiding them from their enemies while opening paths that only the most experienced plainsmen could navigate. It was dawn when they finally reached the Milk River, though the sun remained hidden behind clouds that promised more snow to come. Stone Bear carried Morning Star in his arms while she cradled their son, both of them wrapped in buffalo robes that had become stiff with ice during their night-long flight. The child had survived his traumatic birth and first night of life, though he remained dangerously small and vulnerable to the cold that penetrated even their warmest shelters. Ahead of them, the scattered remnants of the Arikara column were already crossing the river, their horses splashing through water that was black with cold and edged with ice. Chief Charging Bull sat his mount in the shallows, personally ensuring that every member of his tribe made it safely to the northern bank where British law would protect them from American pursuit. "We made it," Stone Bear whispered against Morning Star's ear, his voice thick with exhaustion and relief. "Our son will grow up free, beyond the reach of those who would cage us like animals." But Morning Star's attention was fixed on the small, perfect face of the child she held, seeing in his features the blending of bloodlines that had cost them everything they had once called home. He was neither fully Arikara nor fully Shoshone, but something new, a bridge between worlds, a living symbol of the possibility that love could transcend the boundaries that men created to separate themselves from each other. "What will we call him?" she asked, watching as tiny fingers grasped at the air with the instinctive hunger of life seeking its place in the world. Stone Bear was quiet for a long moment, considering names that would honor both their peoples while acknowledging the unique circumstances of his birth. Finally, he spoke with the formal cadence of one making a declaration that would echo through generations. "He will be called Bridge Walker," Stone Bear announced, "for he was born between worlds and will carry the blood of both in his veins. Let his name remind all who hear it that some bonds are stronger than the hatred that separates peoples, and some loves deep enough to create entirely new ways of being human." As they crossed the Milk River into British territory, Morning Star felt the weight of prophecy settling around her family like a ceremonial robe. Behind them lay everything they had lost: homeland, identity, the comfortable certainties of tribal belonging. Ahead stretched an uncertain future in a foreign land, where they would have to build new lives from the ruins of old dreams. But in her arms, Bridge Walker stirred and opened dark eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages, and Morning Star knew with absolute certainty that every sacrifice had been worth making. This child would grow up knowing that love was stronger than law, that courage could overcome any obstacle, and that sometimes the greatest victory was simply refusing to let hatred win. Years later, when Bridge Walker had grown to manhood and become a leader among the refugee tribes who had found sanctuary in the Canadian wilderness, he would tell the story of his birth during the Great Blizzard, of the parents who had chosen love over loyalty and paid the price in exile and suffering. But he would also tell of the grandfather who had abandoned everything to guide them to safety, of the father who had kept his vow to honor the sacred bond forged beside a dead elk in the snow, and of the mother whose courage had transformed them all from refugees into pioneers of a new way of being. The story would become legend, passed down through generations of children who grew up knowing that their freedom had been purchased with the kind of love that refused to accept the limitations that others tried to impose upon it. And in the telling and retelling, the tale of Morning Star and Stone Bear would become more than just a story of forbidden romance. It would become a testament to the power of the human heart to create new worlds when the old ones became too small to contain the depth of its devotion. As the sun finally broke through the clouds, painting the northern plains with light that seemed to promise redemption, Morning Star pressed her lips to her son's forehead and whispered the vow that would guide the rest of her life. You will grow up free, my son. Free to love whom you choose, free to walk between worlds, free to build bridges where others see only walls. This is the gift your father and I give you, not just life, but the freedom to make that life meaningful. The wind carried her words across the vast expanse of the northern wilderness, where they joined the eternal song of those who had chosen love over fear, hope over hatred, and the difficult path of truth over the easy road of conformity. In that moment, as they crossed the threshold into a new life, Morning Star knew that their exile had become something far more precious. It had become the foundation of a legacy that would echo through time itself. 23 summers had passed since the Great Blizzard, and the settlement that had grown along the Bow River bore little resemblance to the desperate band of refugees who had first crossed into British territory with nothing but hope and determination. What had begun as a collection of hastily erected shelters had evolved into a thriving community where earth lodges stood beside log cabins, where Arikara corn grew in fields tended by Shoshone hands, and where children played games that blended the traditions of a dozen different tribes. Bridge Walker stood on the hill that overlooked the village, his weathered hands clasping those of his twin daughters as they watched the sunset paint the Canadian sky in shades of copper and gold. At 23, he had grown into the living embodiment of his name, tall and strong like his father, with his mother's piercing intelligence and an uncanny ability to see connections where others saw only differences. His daughters, Star Who Walks and River Song, bore the mixed heritage in their faces, their features a beautiful blending of bloodlines that spoke of unity rather than division. Tell us again about the medicine wheel, Papa, Star Who Walks requested, her 7-year-old voice carrying the same persistent curiosity that had once driven her grandmother to defy every tradition simply to hunt in the high country. Bridge Walker smiled and pulled the ancient carved bone artifact from the leather pouch where he always carried it, feeling its familiar weight settle into his palm like a piece of his own soul. The turquoise inlay still gleamed despite the decades, and the silver threads that traced the sacred directions caught the last light of day like captured starlight. This wheel belonged to your grandfather Stone Bear, he began, settling into the rhythm of a story that had been told countless times, but never lost its power to inspire. He carved it with his own hands when he was not much older than you are now, pouring into it all his dreams of a world where different peoples could live in harmony. Below them, the sounds of evening chores drifted up from the village women, calling children in for supper, men returning from the horse herds with the easy laughter of those who had found their place in the world, the gentle lowing of cattle that had been introduced by Scottish settlers who had married into the community and added their own traditions to the growing tapestry of cultures. But the wheel was more than just a beautiful object. Bridge Walker continued, watching his daughters' faces in the golden light. It became a promise, a vow that love could overcome any obstacle, that two people willing to sacrifice everything for each other could create something entirely new. Riversong, always the more practical of the twins, pointed toward the village's central lodge where smoke rose from cooking fires into the evening sky. Is that why Grandmother Morningstar built the Council of Nations there? Because of the promise in the medicine wheel? Bridge Walker nodded, pride swelling in his chest as he thought of his mother's greatest achievement. At 67, Morningstar had become something unprecedented in the history of the Plains, a woman chief whose authority was recognized not just by her own people, but by representatives from tribes scattered across the Northern Territories. The Council of Nations met twice each year in the great lodge she had designed, bringing together Arikara and Shoshone, Lakota and Cheyenne, Cree and Blackfoot, even the occasional delegation of white settlers who had learned that cooperation served them better than conquest. Your grandmother understood something that the old chiefs never did, Bridge Walker explained, his voice carrying the weight of lessons learned through years of watching his parents build something that had never existed before. She saw that survival wasn't about staying separate, about maintaining the old boundaries and the ancient hatreds. It was about creating new connections, building bridges between worlds that had been kept apart for too long. The sound of approaching footsteps made them all turn, and Bridge Walker's heart warmed as he saw his parents climbing the hill toward them, moving with the careful dignity of elders who had earned every line on their faces and every silver thread in their hair. Stone Bear walked with a slight limp now, the old arrow wound having stiffened with age, but his dark eyes still held the fire that had first captured Morningstar's heart beside a frozen elk in the snow. She moved beside him with the fluid grace of a woman who had never lost her connection to the wild places, her hair now white as winter snow but her spirit as fierce as ever. The council has reached a decision about the railroad, Stone Bear announced as he reached the crest of the hill, his voice carrying satisfaction mixed with caution. The Canadian Pacific will build their line through our territory, but only according to terms that protect our sacred sites and hunting grounds. Morningstar settled beside her granddaughters with the easy affection of a woman who had learned to treasure every moment with family. It means change is coming, she said, her fingers automatically reaching for the small beaded pouch where she kept her own sacred objects. But this time, we help shape that change instead of simply enduring it. Bridge Walker understood the implications immediately. The railroad would bring new people, new opportunities, and new challenges to their carefully balanced community. But unlike their ancestors, who had been forced to react to changes imposed from outside, they would meet this transformation as partners rather than victims. What would you have us do? He asked, recognizing the moment when leadership would pass from one generation to the next. Stone Bear and Morningstar exchanged the kind of look that passed between couples who had shared decades of joy and sorrow, triumph and loss. Then Stone Bear reached out and placed the medicine wheel in Bridge Walker's hands, the sacred object seeming to pulse with warmth and power as it found its new keeper. Build more bridges, Morningstar said simply. Your children and their children will face challenges we cannot imagine. But if they remember that love is stronger than fear, that cooperation serves better than conquest, that the wheel of life keeps turning toward justice, then they will find their way. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, 4 generations of the same family sat together on the hill, overlooking the community that had been born from exile and built on the foundation of a love that had refused to accept the limitations others tried to impose upon it. The medicine wheel passed from hand to hand, each person feeling its connection to a story that had become legend, a promise that had become reality, a dream that had transformed into a legacy that would endure long after the last storyteller had fallen silent. In the village below, evening fires began to twinkle like earthbound stars, each one representing a family that had found sanctuary, a story of survival, a hope for the future. And in the distance, barely visible in the gathering darkness, the steel rails that would soon carry the railroad stretched toward horizons that promised new chapters in the never-ending story of human courage, love, and the endless possibility of building something better from the ashes of what came before.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.